We all belong to one. A demographic tribe, that is. In fact, Australia is one big country of many tribes. And if you don't belong to one, you don't survive. Some are easy to find. It might be a footy team, or where you work, or the way you vote, or the way you dress. But there's another set of tribes that are of interest to property investors and business people. The tribes and labels that demographers divide us into. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Baby Boomers and Millennials, but have you heard of FIFOs and VESPAs and Yolos? And do you know what they mean and how understanding demographic tribes can help you target your investments or your business decisions? That's what I'm going to discuss today with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
In my mind, demographics are going to drive our destiny, and over the long term, demographics is going to influence our property markets much more than the short-term ups and downs that we're currently experiencing with concerns about inflation, concerns about interest rates. Now, for the last few years, I've regularly discussed demographic trends in this podcast with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. But today I want to dig deeper into the different demographic tribes in Australia and the plethora of acronyms that come along with them. Now, for those of you who don't know Simon Kuestenmacher is a rising star globally in the field of data management and insights. He's a co-founder of the Demographics Group based in Melbourne, and he's a columnist in the Australian and the New Daily newspapers. Hi, Simon.
Great to be back, Michael.
Now, Simon, demographic tribes, also known as population segments or market segments, are groups of people who share similar interests, similar characteristics, similar behaviours. In Australia, there are a number of demographic tribes that can be identified, and there's been some really clever acronyms that have come up to help understand and classify these groups. But before we get into who these various groups are, why do you think it's important for us to break us as a nation down into tribes?
Well, we want to understand who we are as a nation, and we want to understand rough shifts. We want to see if there is a new group emerging. Generations, of course, are just people that are born in regular intervals, and every 18 years we call them a new generation. But if you look at other market segments, this speaks to a generalized truth in the market. So any kind of marketing professional, any kind of sales professional, any kind of person that wants to understand who might be their future tenant in a investment property might want to have a rough understanding of where the market is shifting. That doesn't mean that all young people fall into that particular category, for example, but it just means you have a rough understanding of how things are going. And of course, it is also meant to be a bit of a light-hearted look at things.
I know that at certain age groups, people have more disposable income, so there are ways of planning where you're going to build a business, place your shop, buy investment properties, understanding what people are going to want at different stages of their life and what disposable income they've got at hand.
Oh, exactly. We know very much when in your life you are spending money, when you are saving money. We know your big expense points in your life. All of these things are, statistically speaking, pretty clear. It always feels, of course, very special and individual when you go through it, because of course you are the hero of your own movie that is your life. But ultimately our lives follow very, very similar outlines.
Well, in property, baby boomers drove property trends for a long time. Being a baby boomer, I remember seeing a lot of these changes, and people have, and I think it was your business partner, Bernard Salt, who talked a bit about like pushing a tennis ball through a garden hose, because there were so many more baby boomers following the previous generation, so we had to build more kindergartens to look after them, more primary schools, more secondary schools, eventually universities, and I guess in due course it's going to be more nursing homes. But rather than just talk about the age groups, let's have a little look at some of the funnier sort of acronyms because it does describe people. And one of the ones I've come up with, I've read a bit about lately is Yolos, the Yolo tribe. You only live once. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so the Yolos, these are people, young people, traditionally people before the family formation stage of the life cycle. These are people that are keen to spend money, and they're not so much interested in the materialistic purchases. They are after experiences. They want to tell positive stories about themselves, to themselves. They're adventurous, they're spontaneous, they need to look for new things. And in my opinion, this bunch of people are people in their 20s and 30s that don't have kids. And why are they so obsessed with experiences? That's the big question here. And I would say, well, they don't have a family yet. So they're not interested in necessarily owning a home, setting down roots. They are most likely atheistic, meaning the meaning of life doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from family because they don't have a family yet. So they seek meaning in life in adventures, in little experiences that they are seeking out.
Trying new things, that makes sense. I guess as a employer, a lot of people listening to this will be employers. It's actually important to understand what motivates your team members, doesn't it?
Oh, very much so. If you feel that you have lots of YOLOs in your team, you want to understand that these people are ultimately looking for meaning in their lives. And you then want to make sure that you allow them, ideally, through your business, so that they can tell a positive story about their lives to themselves. So can you add a bit of meaning, a bit of a bigger story to their lives? Then they will be much more motivated and they will be absolutely great employees. But it also means if you completely fail to do so, you might not get the best out of your workforce.
Or they're going to move elsewhere. Okay, tell us about the Yummies.
Yeah, that's probably one of the funniest ones. These are the young, upwardly mobile millennials. So it's a subgroup of millennials that are essentially just a age cohort. And so you just look at those young folks that are climbing up the career ladders. They had good educations. That means their incomes are reasonably high. And they're...
Let's first of all, Simon, sorry to interrupt you, say that Yummy stands for Young Upwardly Mobile Millennials.
Yes, exactly. So these are the younger cohorts of millennials, and upwardly mobile just means they are highly educated. They are making more money every year. They're entering the knowledge economies, and so they are very tech savvy, and they slowly push higher up the career ladder. They slowly partner up. They become two-income households, so they have lots of money. But they're not setting down roots whatsoever. So they are very, very flexible. The world's their oyster. These are young people that could easily move from Sydney to New York, maybe London, maybe Melbourne, maybe they stay in Sydney. Who knows? They don't know. That's the most important thing. So those guys, they will definitely be renters. If you look at all those fancy new build-to-rent buildings that are essentially targeting sexy 30-year-old lawyers. These kind of buildings, they are targeted as the yummies. Inner city, very posh buildings. That's ideally what the yummies want, as long as they can afford it, but they should be able to afford it because their incomes are actually really yummy, so to speak.
Interesting. And they're prepared to pay a higher rent. Okay. Tell us about the Mammals. And this isn't Mammals like an animal. It's middle-aged men in Lycra. I like this one.
Yeah, it's a bit of a joke there. It is men in their probably mostly 40s and 50s that are still healthy and active because they are the weekend warriors. They are the commuters to work in full-on cycling gear, looking like they will want to win the Tour de France. They enjoy the outdoors, but these are upper class people. Cycling in Australia is not a sport or a way of commuting for the lower classes. This is, funnily enough, very much a upper class, well-educated, reasonably rich kind of sport. And particularly once you hit road bikes, you hit, these things cost at least $5,000 a pop, probably more. There's no upwards boundary. That's what those people want. And so funnily enough, the infrastructure that might make you think of low income people, cycling tracks near the inner city. So in cycling distance, how far could you be? Maybe 10, maybe 15 kilometer from the CBD, no further. These are maybe homes that are purchased, but probably more likely rental opportunities that they're after in the inner city near bike trails, or something like this would be the property goal for the Mammals of this world.
Well, I encounter them every weekend as I try and get out of my street here and up Beach Road, St Kilda Street. I've got to wait for these hordes of mammals. They hunt in packs, Simon, and they take up the road. Okay, Dinks is something a lot of people have heard about. Tell us about the Dinks tribe.
So the Dinks come in two varieties. First and foremost, they're called double income, no kids. So these are households that get a lot of money injected into them because both partners earn money and they have relatively low costs because they don't need to pay for their kids. And the Dinks come in two varieties. The first ones are people before the family formation stage of the life cycle, or maybe couples that will never have kids at all. And they come as empty nesters. And these are people in their late 50s, early 60s or something like this, where the kids have already flown the nest and they are finally able to spend all the money that they earn on themselves. From a marketer's perspective, these people are an absolute joy to be doing business with because the disposable income is high. They enjoy travel, dining out, the finer things of life. If you want to sell to a luxury market, these are the people. Quite often, by the way, if you look at gay couples, they tend to be Dinks. Of course, gay couples can adopt kids, but statistically speaking, they don't, or they do so at very low rates. So essentially, all those suburbs that are dominated by gay couples, they are Dink households. So they have wonderful spending capacity. You really can sell lots of stuff and relatively expensive stuff into these markets. And they are very much on target with what's fashionable, what's cool, what's not. That works really well. They're a great customer or great tenant for your property.
They're great investors as well. We have a lot of them as clients at Metropole, and they're lovely people to work with. Simon, probably one of the first of these acronyms I came across many years ago, look, it probably is way back in the 80s. I'm not sure if it's even used nowadays, was Yuppies. Do people still talk about Yuppies?
I think that's kind of sort of died out a bit, to be honest. So Yuppies are the young urban professionals. And that was the re-emergence of the inner city. For a long while in the 70s, meaning before the 80s, just people moved away from the city center. This is when people moved to suburbia and you commuted from your suburban castle into the office tower in the city center, but you spent your days and your weekends outside of the city. But then in the 80s or thereabouts, people rediscovered the inner city. Inner city lifestyle became hip and sexy again. And the Yuppies were...
Starbucks, things like that came up, didn't it?
Exactly, Starbucks. This is when artists really took over the inner cities. They had all those big, beautiful, repurposed industrial spaces that they made into cool art installations or lifestyle hubs, whatever. That worked really well there. The Yuppies, that's essentially, it's part of the gentrification wave of the inner city. These are, the artists paved the way, then you had the Yuppies move in, and they then established a very vibrant urban ecosystem for people to live near the places that they worked in. The original Yuppies eventually, though, became mostly family. They reached the family formation stage. They grew up, they moved out of this, but a new wave of Yuppies moved into the apartments that they left behind. And that really revitalized the inner city in a big, big way.
Well, then after learning about the Yuppies, I don't know, as I said, probably in the 80s, then all of a sudden it was really cool to be a snag in the 90s, Simon. A sensitive new age guy. And now I keep reading about wags, the wives and girlfriends, notably of sporting stars. So they hit the papers as well. Now, you business partner, Bernard Salt, talks a bit about Kippers, Nettles and Twits. Tell us a little bit about those.
So the Kippers are a beautiful phenomenon that stands for Kids in Parents' Pockets Eroding Retirement Savings. This is the phenomenon of young people just staying in the parental home for much longer, simply because housing is very expensive in our big cities. We're everywhere by now. And so they figured, hey, I might as well stay with mom and dad and I will have an income. And so I just save up for my down payment for my home. In the process, they are essentially just drawing down the parental resources a bit more. But in a sense, it is just the bank of mom and dad subsidizing rent for their kids. It's a way that families that have enough space to have the kids stay at home for longer, just helping them out.
Okay, tell us about the Nettles. Not enough time to enjoy life.
Yeah, so the Nettles, these are busy couples. These are people where the candle is being burned from both ends. You work long hours because you have a big fat mortgage. You can't just possibly scale back your working hours. The costs of living are really high. Back before COVID, you probably had to commute a long way. So that was a problem. So the Nettles, they just worked really hard. Maybe they even had Kippers living at home and cost them money. So this is a very constrained market. This is a market that when they go out and buy stuff, they are more cost sensitive in their purchasing behavior. And they're not as much fun to be dealing with because they don't throw money around as other cohorts might be doing. So the margins that you could get out of this cohort are smaller compared to other cohorts.
Okay, there are also twits, and it's not what some people would initially think.
Yeah, that's a short-term phrase for teenage women in their 30s. And what that is, they're also twits, twit men. This is the idea you behave like a teenager in your shopping behavior, in your consumption patterns, even though you're already in your 30s, which is a life stage where in earlier years, in earlier decades, you might have been already in the family formation stage. But we're now pushing out the family formation stage up into the late 30s. And so we have a younger cohort. So we sometimes call them adolescents. We say adolescence starts at 13 and ends in your mid-30s. It has to do with the definition, with my favorite definition of adulthood. You become an adult when you take responsibility for somebody other's life, for a life that is not your own. And these days, when do you take responsibility for somebody other than yourself? You don't need to do this until you have kids. And kids pop up when you're 35. That means you can be a twit, you can be an adolescent up into your mid-30s. This is where the stereotype of millennials being snowflakes comes from. Because people say, well, or older people say, when I was 30, I already had 3 kids. And you guys are just, out there partying, enjoying, lifestyle events. That stereotype is moving away as now the millennials are starting families.
Sure. People are also talking about Boomerang kids, Simon. And I guess a little bit of that happened over COVID as well.
Exactly. So Boomerang kids are most likely Generation Y, so people born in the 80s and 90s that have moved out of home. They went to university, and then instead of partnering up, buying a house and staying away from the parental home forever, they just come back like a boomerang. And the throwing of the boomerang might be repeated several times after the gap year, after the uni degree, after a first stint of work and moving between cities and then coming back to the home. So you really know that your kids might come back for extended periods relatively frequently. And of course, COVID, any kind of rising costs of living pressures create a bigger cohort of boomerang kids. It's a natural reaction to rising costs, is to go back to mom and dad to kill off one big expense, the rent. And we're seeing this more, or we have been seeing this more and more. But I think in the long run, we shouldn't see this all that much because increasingly who has enough space in their parental home to allow for all those boomerang kids?
Well, I don't think I've fitted into any of those categories yet. We haven't talked about the baby boomers, but I think I found the category that I may fit in, the silver stylers. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so these are people, probably retirees, 65 plus or thereabouts. They have a lot of money, so stylers. They are very sophisticated consumers.
Okay, then I don't fit in. I'm not
So close.
Almost there.
And you will never retire, to be honest.
No.
So they're cosmopolitan in their outlook, and they very much would not identify with the stock standard cliches of what a retiree looks like. They are reinventing retirement. These are active retirees. They look much more fashionable than the retirees of yesteryear than you might think of. So once again, a great cohort to be doing business with. Plus, those silver stylers, we sometimes call them lifestylers, they are a cohort that are rich both in time and money. That is really nice, because most cohorts lack at least one of the two, time and money. But this is a cohort that has both. So they are great to do business with. At the moment, after being locked down for a year or two, they even feel a sense of urgency in their spending behavior. So how good can a consumer get? They have time, they have money, and they feel a sense of urgency. That is a jackpot client. Michael, you are a marketer's dream to be doing business with.
Now, interestingly, on a recent trip, we met some people, and I said to him, the gentleman, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a self-funded philosopher." And I thought, what does that mean? And he said, well, nobody pays me to think. I've stopped working, and so nobody pays me to think anymore. So I think when we talk about the generation, the various tribes, the various demographics, we also look at what happened in various generational groups, starting, I guess, now with the baby boomers. These are the ones born between 46 and 64. And as I mentioned earlier on, they, in many ways, drove the landscapes of our property markets in the past. Now it's the younger generations doing that, because many of those are reaching retirement age, but they own a wealth of real estate. Most of those, Simon, have bought their homes 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's said that half of Australians who own a home don't even have a mortgage. And I think a lot of the baby boomers are in that category, or they've borrowed against their home and they're using the mortgage productively to invest in properties.
Exactly. So the baby boomers are, of course, part of a really big generation. So they came to be after the end of the Second World War. They are a big generation. And lots of things worked in their favor because Australia saw economic upturns. Once they became of voting age, they were really lucky because they were a big cohort in a small country. That means their vote had a lot of clout. And that continues to this day. So if you're being part of a big generation, it's beneficial because you get to shape the country. Your generation shapes the country in a really big and lasting sense. A problem there is that you tend to have a lot of competition for the jobs that are out there. So a small generation like the Gen Xers, they wouldn't feel that a sense of competition between each other all that much. But that's one of the big benefits that the baby boomers had. From a housing perspective, they bought houses when they were relatively cheap, maybe 3, maybe 4 times the annual income was the average house. They did complain about, rightfully so, about really high interest rates of 10, 15%. That said, saving for the down payment in an environment of high interest rates is, of course, much easier than it is now in times of low interest rates and, of course, super high house prices. So it's harder now to get the down payment. But that's it's a bit of a luck of the draw, essentially, where you come into the market. But it's also beautifully predictable. And so we know that the baby boomers have a lot of wealth hidden away in housing, the older generations. And quite often that's untapped. We all live next to an Italian or Greek widow who lives on a quarter-acre block. The property is worth $1.5 million, $2 million, $2.5 million, depending on where we are. And she's actually poor. She's cash poor. And she would never think of downsizing. She really wants to be carried out of the family home. And then in a predictable sense, her 3 kids will cash in once she dies, and they will reinvest this money most likely into the property market. So we know these big picture trends that follow with each generation.
Well, that's really going to be one of the big trends, but probably in the 2030s as the baby boomer women eventually die off, and there's going to be a huge intergenerational transfer of wealth. It's suggested that currently out of there's $9.6 trillion worth of residential real estate. Close to $6 trillion of that is currently owned by baby boomers. So, boy, there's going to be a big transfer of wealth, and of course all the money in the super funds. Following the baby boomers was the Generation Xs. These were the people born in the next years, 65 to 1980. They're now in their 40s and 50s, Simon.
Yes, and so this is a very, very small generation. So remember that when the Gen Xers were meant to be born, the contraceptive pill was introduced that kept the lid on things. No fault divorce was introduced in the early 70s, and the 70s was a decade of low migration intake. So they are forever a small generation, which means politically speaking, they didn't have much clout, because their voices weren't heard so much, because the other generations were just bigger. That said, they could grab enough jobs because there was relatively little competition for jobs. So there are upsides and downsides of being part of a small generation. And they are obsessed with 2 things: work-life balance and gender equality. From a housing perspective, the work-life balance is really interesting, because we know now that we discuss, should you work from home? Should you go back to the office? The Gen Xers, your folks in their 40s and 50s at the moment, they will fight tooth and nail to work from home as much as possible, because they value their lifestyle more than anything else. They're happy to forego a bit of family income in order to have more time available with their families. The baby boomer generation, speaking of course in big fat cliches here and generalizations, they were not happy. They were happy to do this trade-off. They were happy to earn more money and have less time with the families. The Gen Xers do this the other way around. And Gen X is in a difficult decade now, because they are at risk of once again burning the candle from both ends. They still have a mortgage, they still have these costs to be dealing with, they still have kids that depend on them. Most likely they're now soon to enter university, but they might also soon need to have to look after their own parents. So there is lots of pressures on this generation that makes them more likely than any other cohort in Australia to not be able to make all their mortgage repayments on time. They might need to actually, sell up if things go really bad. So that's an issue that Gen X faces. That said, it's not all doom and gloom. There is a bit of seniority built into leadership positions. Already, every single state premier is a Gen Xer. So that means they get, Dominic Perrottet in New South Wales even is a millennial. But because he doesn't have that millennial vibe, I'm counting him as an Xer. That means their voices are being amplified in the political spectrum, because they set the political agenda of this country. So expect much more gender equality issues and much more work-life issues to enter the mainstream under a Gen X leadership in this decade.
The next tribe were those born between 1981 and 96, and I guess they just followed the next alphabetic letter and called them Gen Ys, but a lot of people call them millennials now, Simon.
Exactly. And the millennials, I always joke they're called Gen Y because they ask, why? They are obsessed with meaning, obsessed with purpose. These are the kids of the baby boomers. That means they grew up in financial riches because everything was taken care of. Their baby boomer parents had houses that were paid off rather soon, so they could just pay for wonderful education for millennials. That means the millennials had to face the tyranny of choice. What career should I study? What degree should I pursue? These things, that's difficult for Gen Y. So they don't know what to be dealing with. They are environmentally conscious. They procrastinated. They only now started to have families at scale in their mid-30s. So they procrastinated on this, but now they are looking for housing. It is this, and they are a big generation. And this biggest generation in Australia is now at scale looking for family-sized homes. that's the main game in the property market, is where can we find 3 and 4 bedroom homes for millennials? Whoever
That
provides them, they get them. That they can afford, of course. And so we've seen the millennials over the last 2 years moving away from the hipster flats in the inner city to the urban fringe, because that's where 3 and 4 bedroom houses were available and affordable. They couldn't afford them in the middle suburbs where their baby boomer parents, purchased homes, because their baby boomer parents aren't downsizing just yet. They're still too young, too healthy to think of downsizing. The downsizing is an issue for the 2030s onwards. So we're now pushing the millennials to the urban fringe. That means we're slowly hipsterizing the outer suburbs, because millennials will want to still have, of course, now kids-friendly, but they want kid-friendly hipster cafes to enjoy on their weekend.
Yes. And then there are the younger generations as well, the Gen Zs and Generation Alpha. But Simon, I think it's been a fantastic conversation, because I believe it's really important to recognise the demographic tribes, but also to realise that they're not fixed. They're really broad-based generalities. They're not rigid categories. And people can fit into, well, clearly we could see more than one of these categories. And I think this diversity really enriches our culture in Australia and our society, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's crucial that we're not using those tribes in order to draw them into fighting factions, or that we say generations are opposed to one another. That's silly. Ultimately, you want to make sure that you gather all the generations into the single most important generation why not? A generation that is really, that encompasses people of all age groups, of all different walks of life, to make sure that we can make Australia a better country. Why not? Why isn't that possible? This is ultimately about creating opportunity, creating a country where everybody can thrive, where everybody can reap the benefits of living in a rich country. And of course, this is done in a political arena that sometimes is a bit loud, that sometimes things get a bit ugly, but ultimately we want to create the best outcomes for absolutely every member of every tribe.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for your time. And I know if people want to follow you, Twitter is a place where you're very active. You've got a huge number of followers on Twitter. And if Twitter still remains around and Elon Musk allows us to, I think that's a great place for people to follow you. Also, you have a weekly column every Sunday in the New Daily, which I think gives us great insights into what's ahead for our future. And that's free. It's not behind a paywall like some of the other newspapers. And again, we'll be back once a month on the Michael Yardney podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me again.
In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. But if you enjoyed my chat with Simon Kuestenmacher today and you don't currently subscribe to this podcast, please use the podcast app that you're listening to and click the follow button so you get updated each time a new show comes out. Now, I've been speaking with Simon probably on a monthly basis for over a couple of years now, so you can always go back to the back episodes and hear all the great information he has to share as well. Clearly, demographics are going to drive our markets, and that's one of the reasons the team at Metropole spend a lot of time researching the demographic trends in various areas. But if you enjoyed what you heard from Simon today, you'll love what he teaches the delegates at Wealth Retreat, our 5-day retreat we're going to be conducting at the end of April, and it's designed to help you plan the next 5 years of your life. When you join us, you're going to be surrounded by the best faculty of property, tax, money, business and finance experts who are going to be providing life-changing information. I'm using that term. Well, I'm a bit nervous about saying that, but boy, I've seen the results happening. Okay, let's call it knowledge-sharing sessions, and they're going to mentor you on planning for your future success. You see, the Wealth Retreat theme is where you're going to be in 5 years' time. And that's in all areas of your life, not just money, but relationships and contribution and health and recreation and spirituality. You see, we're going to upgrade your wealth operating system, which is going to change the way you look at your financial future. And then, only then, can we give you a toolbox full of tools to achieve your newly upgraded goals. At Wealth Retreat, we also give you the perfect environment to help set the new goals, but also uncover your own wealth building strategies, because each person's aims are different. You're going to learn from industry experts and you're going to make meaningful connections. See, that's one of the huge benefits at Wealth Retreat, because you're going to have an instant network of already successful property investors, business people, and entrepreneurs. So go to wealthretreat.com.au, read all about it, express your interest, and if you want to come along, I speak with everybody who wants to join us at Wealth Retreat. Well, I speak to everyone who's going to join us at Wealth Retreat to make sure it's right for you, because I back myself, I back you, and offer a money-back guarantee. So why not start planning for a more secure financial future? Go to wealthretreat.com.au. I look forward to getting to know you better.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I want to share with you the concept that how you see the world has a significant effect on your success. You see, there are broadly two ways to see the world. And as I said, they've got a great influence on how successful you become. The first is what psychologists call an external locus of control, and the second's an internal locus of control. I'll explain that in a moment. You see the world around you as it changes, and you can either attribute the success and the failures and the things to the things you've got control over, or you can attribute them to forces outside your influence. And which orientation you choose has a huge bearing on your long-term success. Now, this concept dates back to, I believe, the 1960s, when Julian Rotter's investigations into how people's behaviours and attitudes affected their outcomes of their lives was an important discovery. The locus of control describes what individuals perceive about underlying main causes of all sorts of events in their life. Look, put more simply, are you the pilot of your life, or are you just a passenger? Do you believe that your destiny is controlled by you, or by external forces such as fate, or the government, or your boss, or the system, or other people, or interest rates? Now, in a book, Smarter, Faster, Better, the author Charles Duhigg, he actually explained locus of control pretty well. He said locus of control has become a major topic of study within psychology since the 1950s. He went on to say researchers had found that people with an internal locus of control tend to praise or blame themselves for their successes or their failures, rather than assigning responsibility to things outside their influence. A student with a strong internal locus of control, for instance, would attribute good grades to hard work rather than to natural smarts. He said a salesman with an internal locus of control would blame the loss of a sale on his own lack of hustle rather than bad fortune. He then went on to say internal locus of control has been linked to academic success, higher self-motivation and social maturity, lower incidence of stress and depression, and longer lifespan. And this was attributed to a group of psychologists who wrote in a journal in 2012, Problems and Perspectives in Management. Okay, so people with an internal locus of control tend to earn more money, have more friends, stay married longer, and report greater professional success and satisfaction. Now, let's talk about what is an external locus of control. We all know those people. In fact, sometimes we are those people. Nothing's ever their fault. There's always an excuse. The world's out to get them. Life's unfair. Again, Duhigg described it as follows: having an external locus of control, believing that your life is primarily influenced by events outside your control, is correlated with higher levels of stress, and often because an individual perceives the situation as beyond his or her coping abilities. Well, that's what the psychologist said. Now, the benefits of an internal locus of control, in other words, where you believe you're in charge of the world, you believe you're the pilot, not the passenger, include the fact that you engage in activities that are going to improve your situation. It's going to emphasize more striving for achievement because you believe if you strive, you'll get there. You're going to work harder to develop your knowledge, your skills, your abilities. People with an internal locus of control, they're inquisitive and they try and figure out why things turned out the way they did. They take a note of the information they've used to get a positive outcome, and they're going to keep using it in the future. And if you're a boss, you end up having a more participative management style. So the bottom line is you weren't born with an unalterable locus of control. So in my mind, it's critical to keep an eye on yourself and see how you can improve the way you see the world. Sure, bad things are going to happen to us, but rather than dwelling on them, it's better to find a useful belief about them and move on. It's important to remove the idea that your life's dictated by voices outside your control. Look, of course, to one degree or another, it is. But there's plenty that we can control. You can create your own luck through study, through hard work, through perseverance. It's often said that you become a blend of the 5 people you hang around with the most. Now, that's important to keep in mind. Associate with positive people who believe they're in control of their lives. Their beliefs and energy is going to rub off on you, and then yours will rub off on them. If you think about it, that becomes a very powerful positive feedback loop. So, as I started to say, how you see the world will have a significant effect on your success. Are you going to end up being the pilot of your life, having an internal locus of control, or just a passenger and be unhappy and dissatisfied because you don't have control? Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?